All right, so we're gonna do a little reading here, and then we'll basically just decide what one we wanna go in on. And I like to have a little beat in the background, maybe some light music or instrumental, acoustic, something like that. Gets my mind working a little bit. So people have been talking about economics and stuff like that, so no better person to study than, Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. All right, so we'll get it kicked off and see where it goes. Oh. Okay. Like the probability, like that, any particular person shall ever be qualified for the employment to which he is educated is very different in different occupations. In the greater part of mechanic, trades, success, is almost certain, but very uncertain is the liberal professions, put your son apprentice to a shoemaker. There is little doubt of his learning to make a pair of shoes, but send him to study the law. It is at least 20 to 1 if ever he makes such proficiency as will enable him to live by the business in a perfectly fair lottery. Those who draw the prices ought to gain all that is lost by those who draw the blanks in a profession where 20 fail for one that succeeds. That one ought to gain all that should have been gained by the unsuccessful 20. The counselor at law who perhaps at near 40 years of age begins to make something by his profession ought to receive the retribution not only of his own so tedious and expensive education, but that of more than 20 others who are never likely to make anything by it. How extravagant. It's the quantity of every commodity brought to market naturally suits itself to the effectual demand. It is the interest of all those who employ their land, labor, or stock in bringing any commodity to market, that the quantity should never should exceed the the effectual demand. And so the quantity of every commodity brought to market naturally suits itself to the effectual demand. It is the interest of all those who employ their land, labor, or stock in bringing any commodity to market that the quantity never should exceed. So obviously I'm going a little bit to the beat a little bit. If you were a professor, you want to keep the attention of the audience. So working in melody into the way in which you would speak would help a professor do better at their job. Okay. All right. Though a certificate carries along with it no testimonial of good, behavior and certifies nothing but that, the person belongs to the parish to which he really does belong. It is altogether discretionary in the parish officers either to grant or to refuse a, it's the proportion which, the usual market rate of interest ought to bear to the ordinary rate of clear profit necessarily varies as profit rises or falls. Double interest is in Great Britain. Reckon what the merchants call a good, moderate, reasonable profit terms, which I apprehend mean no more than a common and usual in a country. Okay. So, it's like chapter, like X. Like, of wages and profit and the different employments of labor and stock, the whole of the advantages and disadvantages of the different employments of labor and stock must in the same neighborhood be either perfectly equal or continually tending to equality. If in the same neighborhood there was any employment evidently either more or less advantageous than the rest, so many people would crowd into it in the one case, and so many would desert it in the other, that its advantages would soon return to the level of other employments. This at least would be the case in a society where things were left to follow their natural course, where there was perfect liberty, and where every man was perfectly free both to choose what occupation he thought proper and to change it is as often as he thought proper. Every man's interest would prompt him to seek the advantageous and to shun the disadvantageous employment. Pecuniary wages and profit indeed are everywhere in Europe extremely different according to the different employments of labor and stock, but this difference arises partly from certain circumstances in the employments themselves, which either really or at least in the imaginations of men make up for a small pecuniary gain in some and a counterbalance, a great one in others, and partly from the policy, of Europe, which, nowhere leaves things at perfect liberty, like the particular consideration of those circumstances and of that policy will divide this chapter into two parts: inequalities arising from the nature of the employments themselves. The five following are the principal circumstances which, so far as I have been able to observe, make up for a small pecuniary gain in some employments and counterbalance a great one in others. First, the agreeableness or disagreeableness of the employments themselves. Secondly, the easiness and the cheapness or the difficulty and expense of learning them. Thirdly, the constancy or inconstancy of employment in them. Fourthly, the small. We have a bit of a GDP problem in the United States of America, so I want to do my part to, essentially the goal here would be increase the overall GDP of America. Okay? All right, cool. All right, chapter 6, of the component parts, of the price of commodities in that early and rude state of society, which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, the proportion between the quantities of labor necessary. Next. Okay. All right. You know, it's like in that like early and rude state of society, which precedes both the accumulation of stock and the appropriation of land, the proportion between the quantities of labor necessary for acquiring different objects seems to be the only circumstance which can afford any rule for exchanging them for one another. If among a nation, all right, so like, you know, like the nations that like according to like the best like authenticated like history like appear to have been like first civilized like were like those that dwelt round like the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, that sea by far the greatest inlet that is known in the world, having no tides nor consequently any waves except such as are caused by the wind, only was by the smoothness of its surface as well as by the multitude of its islands and the proximity of its neighboring shores extremely favorable to the infant navigation of the world, when from their ignorance of the compass men were afraid to quit the view of the coast, and from the imperfection of the art of shipbuilding to abandon themselves to the boisterous waves of the ocean, to pass beyond the pillars of Hercules, that is, to sail out of the straits of Gibraltar, was in the ancient world long considered as a most wonderful and dangerous exploit of navigation. It was laid before even the Phoenicians and, you know, like Lauderdale, like writing with varying degrees of moderation, like notably in his like notes on like Adam Smith's like Wealth of Nations, nevertheless posed questions seriously to be considered. Some later commentators representative of a genre have been even less moderate, but do deserve the attention of the reader. Murray Rothbard, for example, concluded that Smith's reputation was a mystery and a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. The mystery is the enormous and unprecedented gap between Smith's exalted reputation and the reality of his dubious contribution to economic thought. Between 1741 and 1750, however, the bounty must have hindered the price of corn from falling so low in the home market as it naturally would have done during these 10 years. The quantity of all sorts of grain exported, it appears, from the custom house books amounting to no less than 8,029,156 quarters. 1 bushel, the bounty paid for this amounted to a figure that you can't even pronounce. Good luck to you in professions in which there are no benefices, such as law and physics, if an equal proportion of people were educated at the public expense, the competition would soon. Alright, dude. Okay, the quantity of every commodity brought to market naturally suits itself to the effectual demand. It is the interest of all those who employ their land, labor, or stock in bringing any commodity to market that the quantity never should exceed the effectual demand. And it is the interest of all other people that it never should fall short of that demand. If at any time it exceeds the effectual demand, some of the component parts of its price must be paid below their natural rate. If it is rent, the interest of the landlords will immediately prompt them to withdraw a part of their land, and if it is wages or profit, the interest of the laborers in the one case and of their employers in the other. Name's motherfucking Bodie will prompt them to withdraw a part of their labor or stock from this employment. The quantity brought to market will soon be no more than sufficient to supply the effectual demand. All the different part of its price will rise to their natural rate, and the whole price to its natural price. If, on the contrary, the quantity brought to market should at any time fall short of the effectual demand, some of the component parts of its price must rise above their natural rate. If it is rent, the interest of all other landlords will naturally prompt them to prepare more land for the raising of this commodity. If it is wages or profit, the interest of all other laborers and dealers will soon prompt them to employ more labor and stock in preparing and bringing it to market. The quantity brought thither will soon be sufficient to supply the effectual demand. All the different parts of its price will soon sink to their natural rate, and the whole price of to its natural price. The natural price, therefore, is as it were the central price to which the prices of all commodities are continually gravitating. Different accidents may sometimes keep them suspended a good deal above it, and sometimes force them down even somewhat below it. But whatever may be the obstacles which hinder them from settling in this center of repose and continuance, they are constantly tending towards it. The whole quantity of industry annually employed in order to bring any commodity to market naturally suits itself in this manner to the effectual demand. So think of it like college, think of it like university. You can obtain it here on YouTube and you can learn something. If this is something that fits with you, this would be a version of doing a lecture that is entertaining, right? Okay. But in some employments, the same quantity of industry will in different years produce very different quantities of commodities, while in others it will produce always the same or very nearly the same number of laborers. In husbandry will in different years produce very different quantities of corn, wine, oil, hops, etc., but the same number of spinners and weavers will every year produce the same or very nearly the same quantity of linen and woolen cloth. It is only the average produce of the one species of industry which can be suited in any respect to the effectual demand, and as its actual produce is frequently much greater and frequently much less than its average produce, the quantity of the commodities brought to market will bodily sometimes exceed a good deal and sometimes fall short a good deal of the effectual demand. Even though that demand therefore should continue always the same, the market price will be liable to great fluctuations, will sometimes fall a good deal below and sometimes rise a good deal above their natural price. In the other species of industry, the produce of equal quantities of labor being always the same or very nearly the same, it can be more exactly suited to the effectual demand, while that demand continues the same. Therefore, the market price of the commodities is likely to do so too, and to be either altogether or as nearly as can be judged of the same with the natural price that the price of linen and woolen cloth is, liable neither to such frequent nor to such. When an independent workman such as a weaver or a shoemaker has got more stock than what is sufficient to purchase the materials of his own work and to maintain himself till he can dispose of it, he naturally employs one or more journeymen with the surplus in order to make a profit by their work. Increase this surplus, and he will naturally increase the number of his journeymen. The demand for those who live by wages, therefore, necessarily increases with the increase of the revenue and stock of every country, and cannot possibly increase without it. The increase of revenue and stock is the increase of national wealth. The demand for those who live by wages, therefore, naturally increases with the increase of national wealth and cannot possibly increase without it. It is not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continual increase, which occasions a rise in the wages of labor. It is not accordingly in the richest countries, but in the most thriving, or in those which are growing rich the fastest, that the wages of labor are highest. Princes and sovereign states have frequently fancied that they had a temporary interest to diminish the quantity of pure metal contained in their coins, but they seldom have fancied that they had any to augment. So a lot of times when you want to do help, for your country, right, a lot of times, or what could happen potentially, is you could give all that help to a country, but you could have the mass majority of the people say no, there is nothing that needs to be fixed, no, there is nothing wrong when you make these efforts, right? So generally speaking, if you wanted to do good in the world, it would almost by definition happen in another country other than the United States of America, because you could speak up in the United States of America and they could just essentially say, no, everything's good here, everything's good here, everything's good here, and just everybody lies. Okay. The other places won't help, all right? Princes and sovereign states have frequently fancied that they had a temporary interest to diminish the quantity of pure metal contained in their coins, but they seldom have fancied that they had any to augment it. The quantity of metal contained in the coins, I believe, of all nations has accordingly been almost continually diminishing and hardly ever augmenting. Such variations therefore tend almost always to diminish the value of a money rent. The discovery of the mines of America diminished the value of gold and silver. This diminution, it is commonly supposed, though I apprehend without any proof, is still going on gradually and is likely to continue to do so for a long time upon this supposition. Therefore, such variations are more likely to diminish than to augment the value of the money rent, even though it should be stipulated to be paid. Not in such a quantity of coined money, of such a denomination in so many pound sterling, for example, but in so many ounces, either of pure silver or of silver of a certain standard. The rents which have been reserved in coin have preserved their value, like much like better than those like which have been like reserved in like money, like even like we're like the denomination of like the coin has not been altered by the 18th of Elizabeth. It was enacted that a third of the rent of all college leases should be reserved in coin to be paid either in kind or according to the current prices at the nearest public market. The money arising from this coin rent. So actually, as an intellectual or as a teacher, thought leader of the world, you want to smarten up the entire nation or whatever it may be. You want to make people better, make people smarter. Your target market is this: 3-year-olds.